Easter Sunday, 1478. In the Grand Duomo, the city's powerful families gather for the Mass. Two young men dressed in elaborate attire, obviously from one of the powerful families of Florence, are seated at the front. Their friends and retainers are seated around them. The Mass progressed as usual and reached the point when the priest raises the consecrated host. Everyone in the church were kneeling with their heads bowed. Then, all hell breaks loose. A group of men lunge forward from behind the two young men, stabbing them from behind. One young man, caught completely off guard, falls to the ground. The other young man, bleeding, struggles to roll away. What is happening? The person who made the Medici family the most powerful one in Florence was Cosimo de Medici. Cosimo had two sons, Piero and Giovanni. The elder son Piero suffered a serious case of gout that was so severe that he was bedridden quite often. The younger son Giovanni was relatively healthy, but he didn't get married until he was 30. Because of this, Cosimo de Medici placed all his hopes for the future of the family in his brilliant and dutiful grandson, Lorenzo de Medici. Cosimo put a great emphasis on Lorenzo's education, and, even at a young age, Lorenzo was aware of the responsibilities placed upon him and worked hard to learn everything his grandfather taught him. As a result, he gained significant business acumen early in life, closely observing his grandfather. He also received a broad education in art and literature. He immersed himself in topics such as ancient Greek and Roman mythology, theology, and all other areas of the humanities. Lorenzo developed a sharp intellect at a young age, growing into a remarkable figure. After Cosimo de Medici passed away, his son, Piero, briefly led the Medici family and Florence. But Piero died just 5 years later, and Lorenzo de Medici took on the responsibility of leading both the Medici family and Florence. He was only 20 years old at the time. He had a younger brother, Giuliano, who was 5 years junior. Now this painting, currently housed in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, is titled The Adoration of the Magi. This painting was created by Sandro Botticelli and was commissioned by a Florentine merchant named Gaspare. And when you look at the painting, you can see the entire painting is filled with flattery for the Medici family, who was the patron of both Gaspare's family and the painter himself. The subject of the painting is the adoration of the infant Christ by the three wise men. Cosimo de Medici is depicted touching the feet of the baby Jesus. Kneeling below him are Cosimo's two sons, Giovanni and Piero. By the time this painting was made, all three of them had already passed away, and Lorenzo was the head of the Medici family. Now, right behind Cosimo in the painting, you see a figure wearing a hat and a white robe. This is Lorenzo de Medici. Lorenzo is surrounded by the prominent figures of Florence at the time. Opposite Lorenzo stands a man with dark hair and dressed in black. This is Lorenzo's younger brother, Giuliano de Medici. Both Lorenzo and Giuliano were known to be exceptionally talented and highly educated. But among the two brothers, Lorenzo excelled in nearly every field, including governance and diplomacy. But God often does not give one man everything. There was one thing in which Giuliano surpassed Lorenzo, and that was his looks. Lorenzo had a strong, somewhat stern-looking face. He almost has the look of the main villain in movies. In contrast, Giuliano was described as exceptionally handsome. Also, unlike the dutiful and serious Lorenzo, Giuliano was a carefree youth, enjoying the life of luxury while practicing the family's trademark generosity. He was loved by his family and by Florence. His friends described him as mild and kind man who was respectful of his brother. The two brothers ruled Florence together. Lorenzo faithfully followed his grandfather's footsteps, including Cosimo's policy of helping the common folks and connecting with the citizens. and as with his grandfather, Lorenzo continued to receive the enthusiastic support of the Florentine citizens. In our last video, we introduced the three great families that ruled Florence before the rise of the Medici, which were the Albizzi, the Strozzi, and the Pazzi families. And after the failed attempt to exile Cosimo, the Albizzi and the Strozzi were mostly destroyed. But the Pazzi family survived by switching to ally with the Medici. Though diminished by the ascendance of the Medici, Pazzi was still a prestigious and influential family in Florence. If you visit Florence, you can still see how influential Pazzi family was at the time. The Pazzi Chapel, located next to the Basilica of Santa Croce, is an architectural masterpiece designed by the renowned architect Brunelleschi, who was considered Florence's greatest builder. The size and grandeur of the chapel reflects the wealth and prominence of the Pazzi family at the time, and the Medici and Pazzi families had solidified their alliance with marriage. Lorenzo's sister Bianca was married to Giuliano de Pazzi, who was a nephew of the Pazzi family's patriarch, Jacopo de Pazzi. But, as Confucius said, there cannot be two suns in the sky. Turned out, the Pazzi family was not satisfied with playing second fiddle to the Medici, and they were looking for an opportunity to strike. At that time, the reigning pope was Sixtus IV. Pope Sixtus IV was not content with being a spiritual leader. He wanted political and secular control as well, and was constantly expanding the papal state. And his expansion of papal state, especially into the Tuscany region, led to tension with Florence. For example, in 1474, Sixtus IV attempted to appoint Francesco Salviati as the Archbishop of Pisa, a crucial and strategic religious post. At that time, Pisa was under the Florentine influence. Pisa was a place that Florence had to pass through to reach the sea, so Florence could not afford to lose their influence over it. Lorenzo de Medici viewed Salviati as an ally of the Pope, and a potential threat to Medici control over the region. So, as the de facto ruler of Florence, Lorenzo used his influence to delay Salviati's installation and refused to recognize him as the legitimate archbishop, thus effectively blocking Salviati from taking up his position. But that was not the first time the Pope and the Medici clashed. Medici had long been acting as the bank for the papacy, and Pope Sixtus IV's various wars strained the finances of the papacy. So when the Pope wanted to take out another huge loan from the Medici Bank to purchase a territory around the city of Imola, Lorenzo refused to give him the loan. So, the relationship between the Medici and the Pope was already strained, and the clash over Pisa made it even worse. And there, the Pazzi family saw an opportunity. So, in the summer of 1477, Pope Sixtus IV met with his nephew, Girolamo Riario, and Francesco Salviati, the archbishop who still couldn't take up his seat in Pisa. By this time, Salviati and Riario were already connected with the Pazzi. They discussed how to resolve the situation with Medici. Your Holiness, the Medici has been interfering with the works of the papal state far too long. We can take care of the Medici family for your Holiness. The Pope asked, how? They answered, you need to just get rid of 2 men. The rest will crumble. By 2 men, they meant Lorenzo de Medici and his younger brother Giuliano. The 2 were still quite young, but with their father already dead, they were in charge of the family. And, as they had no heirs old enough to succeed them, getting rid of the 2 brothers will effectively end the Medici's dominance. When they explained this plan to the Pope, he replied, I know nothing of this, and I cannot condone this. Now what does this mean? Does it mean, don't do it? Or does it mean, do what you need to do, but, since, as the Pope I cannot be seen as supporting murder, I am going to just pretend I didn't know about this. The conspirators took it as the latter, interpreting it as a tacit support from the Pope. So, in 1478, they decided to take action. Lorenzo de Medici was 29 years old, and Giuliano was 24. At that time, the young nephew of Pope Sixtus IV, Raffaele Riario, who was also a relative of one of the conspirator Girolamo Riario, had just been made a cardinal. and while traveling, he stopped by at Florence to see Girolamo. This was a good excuse to invite Lorenzo and Giuliano de Medici to a celebratory banquet. The plan was to poison the brothers during the banquet. But, unfortunately for the conspirators, Giuliano didn't show up to the banquet. He had already gone to another party the night before, and was still too hungover. This was not good. The plan would only work if the two brothers were both killed. But the conspirators had a plan B, and that plan was to kill the brothers the very next day, during the Easter Sunday Mass. At Easter, Lorenzo and Giuliano would attend Mass at the Florence Cathedral, known as the Duomo. Lorenzo would sit on the right, and Giuliano on the left. The conspirators had carefully planned their attack. They knew the brothers would be at the front of the congregation. The assassins would sit behind the brothers, and at the signal, swiftly stab both to death. And at the same time, a group outside the church would seize control of the Palazzo della Signoria, which is Florence's government building. Francesco Salviati, the Archbishop of Pisa, would lead this group. The morning of the Easter Sunday came, but there was a small problem. Because of all the last-minute changes in the plan, the assassin hired to kill Lorenzo had gotten nervous and backed out of the plan. But the conspirators could not afford to miss another chance. So the conspirators made a priest and a papal notary to carry out the attack on Lorenzo instead. And, to make sure Giuliano wouldn't miss the Mass, Francesco de Pazzi, who was close to Giuliano, personally visited the Medici palace. Giuliano was still unwell, but was nonetheless persuaded to go. And when they reached the Santa Maria del Fiore, also known as the Duomo, Bernardo di Bandino Baroncelli, a Florentine merchant who was well-known acquaintance to both Medici and Pazzi families, greeted Giuliano with a big hug. This friendly hug was to check that Giuliano was not wearing a chainmail under his clothes. The Easter Sunday Mass proceeded as any other Mass. Then, during Mass, at the point when the priest raised the consecrated host and everyone is kneeling with their heads bowed, it happens. Francesco Pazzi and Baroncelli lunged forward, grabbed Giuliano, and stabbed him from the back. The priest and the notary did the same to Lorenzo, but Lorenzo managed to dodge the attack. The Medici supporters around Lorenzo drew swords. Lorenzo was wounded, but managed to jump over the chairs in front of him and sprinted towards the sacristy, which is a small room where various things used in the service were kept. A few Medici retainers blocked the pursuers and locked themselves in the sacristy with Lorenzo. The remaining Lorenzo's guards clashed with assassins. In the ensuing struggle, Lorenzo's men managed to subdue the attackers, but Giuliano was already dead, stabbed 19 times in the torso. Lorenzo's Pazzi brother-in-law Giuliano started screaming, "I am not a traitor, I knew nothing of this." Raffaele Riario, the Pope's young nephew, turned pale and was desperately praying at the high altar. Soon, the entire city of Florence was in turmoil. Word of the attack spread quickly through the city, and a few of the citizens climbed to their rooftops and shouted, "Pale, pale!" This was a signal that a member of the Medici family was under attack. And, remarkably, thousands of Florentines dropped what they were doing as soon as they heard this call and rushed to defend the Medici. They soon organized themselves into groups and started to accompany the Medici family members and their guards to root out anyone who was trying to harm the Medici. In the meantime, as they originally planned, Jacopo de Pazzi was trying to get the people of Florence to revolt against the Medici. So he rode through the streets of Florence, shouting, "Freedom! Freedom!" But the response of the Florentine people was not what he expected, and he was attacked by the crowd supporting the Medici family. Archbishop of Pisa was supposed to lead another group to seize the Palazzo dei Signoria. So he went there and tried to convince the official there to let him into the palace. But the official got suspicious and he was arrested by the guards instead. Francesco de Pazzi had accidentally stabbed himself during his attack on Giuliano, so he went back to the Pazzi palace after the murder and was arrested there. After Lorenzo managed to escape the church, he looked for his younger brother. After hearing that Giuliano was already dead, Lorenzo was furious. He could not allow this attack to go unanswered. While he could not kill Pope's nephews, Lorenzo captured many of the Pope's allies who had been involved in the plot. And in the trial run by the government dominated by Lorenzo, all of the conspirators were harshly punished. The Pazzi were all arrested or exiled, including his own brother-in-law. Their property were confiscated, and all the family crests were obliterated from the city. Francesco de Pazzi was hanged from the windows of Palazzo di Signoria. Jacopo managed to escape, but Lorenzo's men pursued him, and captured him while trying to cross the Apennines. He was beaten to death. As for Bernardo di Bendino Baroncelli, Lorenzo pursued him for months, and finally captured him in Constantinople, where he had taken refuge. He was brought back to Florence and was hanged. And the Archbishop of Pisa? Lorenzo knew killing the Archbishop appointed by the Pope would amount to openly defying the Pope. But Lorenzo could not let him escape. The Archbishop was hanged alongside Francesco de Pazzi. So, today, you heard the story of the event known as the Pazzi Conspiracy. Was it all true? Most of the details in today's story was taken from an eyewitness account by Angelo Policiano, which was written within 3 months of the event. But, bear in mind that Policiano was one of Lorenzo's retainer, so he definitely had the motivation to exaggerate the brutality of the attack to justify the bloody retribution that followed. But still, the fact that this blatant attack took place on the holiest day of the Christian calendar, at the most solemn moment of raising the host during the High Mass, is shocking to say the least. So, this set the stage for the coming war between Lorenzo de Medici and Pope Sixtus IV. Although he had not directly ordered the assassination, his involvement, as well as that of his close allies, became clear during the investigation. And the Pope had other, non-military means to punish the Medici and the people of Florence. What did he do? And how would Lorenzo end this conflict with one of the most powerful ruler in Europe? We will continue with this story in our next video, so please like and subscribe to continue receiving our story. And check out our playlist on other stories from history. It really helps a small channel like us